Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sage's Tabletop Table Talks. I'm Sage, and I'm going to talk to you guys about tabletop role playing games. This is part 3 of a series I've been doing, wherein I've been talking about magic martials, the physical and the paranormal, you know, super science and super studs. But basically, the idea here is you have games, fantasy and science fiction games that mix magic or super science and characters who are predominantly physical and technical in nature, and kind of the issues that lie within both. I dropped my cap. Um, but yeah, I had to stare down a cat. Anyway, I have kittens in the house. They are mischievous. They're at the age now where they're just mischievous. Anyway, so we've talked about magic, we've talked about martial characters, and I want to kind of talk about the idea of balance between the two. Um, the easy short answer is how do you balance the two? And that is you give each of them equal opportunity and ability to affect the narrative and the game flow in equal measure. Now, that is far easier said than done because you can look at other games and see things like thief type characters and how they don't really, especially older editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and the way they kind of, they're not very useful except in a very specialist role. Things like picking locks and things like that. Um, hey, quit that. Hey, come on. Anyway, but they are still a very useful part to the party because they fill in a specialist role. You know, fighters, and they kind of do a similar thing. And like the older editions of Dungeons and Dragons, fighters were quite powerful simply because they had survivability. They had enough hit points to take enough hits to actually move to the next level. They leveled up faster in older editions. They had better saving throws against things like poisons and spells than other characters did. And what that meant was they actually had the opportunity to advance, wherein a number of other character classes like wizards or thieves, um, clerics, guess maybe. Clerics are kind of tough too. But, and so their abilities were far more, um, and in older editions of Dungeons and Dragons, the main gameplay loop was go to a dungeon, clear it out, earn experience points, continue on. The idea of like these narratives with characters simply weren't as prominent as they are today. You know, people didn't really care as much about telling a story with Jim the fighter. It was more about take Jim the Fighter into a dungeon, earn power, earn money and experience points, and in older editions, money was experience points. Bring him out, power him up, and go into a harder dungeon. And if a character died, you rolled up a new one and you went on. That's less true today. Today, the huge people get attached to their characters and their character story. Unfortunately, there is still a lot of old designs, like the idea of the fighter being this guy who walks in, hits monsters, and goes away. And they've done various things to try to make them more interesting, but they've never really done the important thing to making a fighter more interesting, which is giving him the ability to control narrative and flow. Except in Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition. And it's so funny because I keep bringing 4th edition up, even though I didn't like it. And in my lukewarm defense of 4th edition video, I kind of go and explain my feelings. And So, but fourth edition had some valuable lessons to teach us about how, specifically, fourth edition went a little too far with the balance by making almost every class archetype feel too identical. And that's not interesting. But there are lessons to be learned, and very much in Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, your fighter type classes would often have abilities to pull a little bit of narrative and flow control away from the Dungeon Master. And a lot of people didn't like that. Wizards have been doing that forever. For example, a Dungeon Master puts a locked door in front of you, expecting you to find a key, maybe pick the lock, but a wizard simply casts the knock spell, and then they just rest that part of the narrative away from the DM. Interacting with an NPC, I'm talking about maybe I'll have to make a video about the 3 pillars of gaming. They're a little reductive, but I also talk about gamist, simulationist, and narrativist. But the idea is that in gaming, there's role-playing, there's exploration, there's combat. And fighters are exclusively... And in 4th edition, every character was combat. That was kind of the theme. So in combat, the DM decides what monsters do. And so, like, they choose where monsters attack, where they go, what kind of attacks they use. But a lot of characters in 4th edition had the ability to modify what DM monsters did. In games like 3rd edition and 5th edition, wizards have that ability. They can use dominate, hold person, banishment to wrestle that control away from dungeon masters that fighters don't have. So how do we balance physical and paraphysical and paranormal characters against each other? Give them but that, like I said, that's reductive, because a thief and a fighter, in the Mech Warrior campaign that I have played, I kind of played a technical character, like a scientist character, and even though, because I had a light mech, I wanted lots of skills, so I took a weaker mech in order to get more skills. So in that combat pillar, my character was far weaker. But he was still useful because he had a lot of technical skills, repair and hacking and things like that, that made him lesser in that combat pillar, but higher in the exploration pillar and roleplay pillar. See, that's kind of why I don't like that, because it wasn't really exploration, but I kind of see what it is. But whereas another character had a heavier mech, and the skills they did invest in were combat skills. So they were a beefy bruiser, making them more useful in combat and less useful in the exploration and a lesser extent roleplay pillars. So even though in a fight we weren't the same, we still brought the same level of usefulness to the party. The thing about a lot of super science or magical characters is they often are given, because the idea of super science's versatility, magic's versatility, they are given tools to use in all 3 pillars, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Bards in Dungeons and Dragons are a good example. A good example of that. They're decent in combat, decent in exploration, decent in roleplay. They're very good in roleplay, but honestly, so is a rogue with high charisma, so is a paladin with high charisma. Rogues are best in roleplay, but the idea that they are the roleplay characters is not really true. I'll get into that when I talk about the three pillars. But this idea, but they kind of can play a support role for any other class. A character like a paladin is a predominantly can do fighter stuff, but with a high charisma because a lot of their paranatural abilities rely on charisma. They actually make very good characters in the roleplay element. So even though they are fighters, they're still combat. Even though they are combat, they are still very useful in another pillar. Wizards and sorcerers have a huge problem wherein they are as good, if not better, than anyone else at all three. You're in a roleplay scenario, and you can cast Charm Person or a Psychic Power, or use something of that nature. Use like a pheromone drug in a super science. You can just outdo any naturally charismatic character in a social situation. Same with exploration, the Nock example I continuously use. And there are other examples, but Nock's one that is just a very obvious one. Using invisibility and silence in order to sneak into a mansion that a rogue could do with his skills. But now, yeah, the rogues still probably do it, but he is less a character designed for stealth and more a carrier for the wizards' invisibility and silence that have removed that obstacle. Removing obstacles is what you do in these role-playing games. The rogue removes that trapped door. The rogue sneaks into that building. The fighter kills that monster. The bard talks to that king. So you remove obstacles. That's realistically at the very heart of the game. What you're doing is the DM puts obstacles in front of you, and then you use your wits and your skills and luck to remove said obstacles. But like I said, the big issue is that wizards just can remove obstacles better, if not as well as any other character. Once again, you're looking at the fight. Rosie, you're not going out. Rosie, you're not going in the basement. Rosie. Rosie, no. Anyway, but you're not going into that basement, and the fighter can defeat the enemy with his melee attacks. The wizard has, in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, wizards get a spell called Firebolt that deals 1d8 damage. They can use that as often as they want. That is literally as much damage as a longsword. Longswords get a little bit more just because strength bonus. I don't remember if wizards get intelligence bonus to that damage or not. But a wizard can output comparable damage to a fighter. Warlocks get Eldritch Blast, which is incredibly powerful, but that's kind of what warlocks get, is Eldritch Blast. But wizards also get spells like Hold Person, like Disintegrate, like Power Word Kill, that can effectively remove that combat obstacle with more efficiency than the fighter can. Like I said, in Charm Person, the enemy makes a will, it might be Charisma saving throw now, but they make some kind of saving throw, some kind of resistance check to avoid just being beaten in this role-playing scenario, as opposed to a dice roll on the part of the character. Give me 1 second. Rosie, quick. Come on. Yep. You want to go outside? There you go. You can go outside. Anyways, they can remove that obstacle, that social obstacle, much in the same way that a rogue can. A rogue makes a skill check and then gets an opposed insight check. Although there's the static insight check, which just kind of is the same as a saving throw, but it puts it in the hands of the skill check as opposed to in the hands of the saving throw. Very much the same idea, though. But Charmed Person has a lot more power with what it is able to do to the character that it is being used on. That's not even to say a spell like Dominate or Command. So there's a couple of ways. So I'm kind of gone off topic. Not a lot of background. So how do we balance them? One of the best ways to balance them, I think, is to cut down those toolkits for magic users and for super science users. Give wizards a far more limited spell list in Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure that will ever happen at this point, but if you're designing a similar kind of game, limit what wizards can do. Make sure that now some games have taken it too far the other direction. I cannot remember for the life of me a game I saw. Call of Cthulhu kind of does this, but magic is supposed to be this unknowable force that's kind of terrifying. Cthulhu Tech kind of does this. Cthulhu Tech kind of does this. Wherein the usage of spells are these huge rituals that take hours and cost thousands of dollars. But in the sense of most exploration, combat, and roleplay, that's not useful because you don't normally have 3 days to set a spell up before you create that effect. Obviously you can maybe prepare something like an invisibility spell if you know you're going to be going on an infiltration mission, but any kind of combat ability, if you can't cast it like that, is not very useful as a combat ability. But the first thing to do is to, like I said, limit spell. Back to restricted schools in spellcasters, or make it Shadowrun tries. I think they've played with this a little bit, and there certainly is this idea there where the more super tech you put into your body, the less human you become. You have an essence stat, which is 6.0, because making people calculate decimal points isn't something that most people absolutely scoff at, even though effectively it's the same if you just, instead of it being 0.2, it's 20, and instead of 6.0, it's, no, it'd be 0.2 would be 2, 6.0, 60, or 20 and 600, honestly. Move the decimal point over 1, so you get 2 and 60. But so if you get this thing that increases your combat efficiency, you lose humanity. You lose enough humanity, you become you don't die, but you effectively become NPC'd. Also, if you lose, the more humanity you lose, the less effective your spellcasting is. Meaning, characters that are casters have to beware, you need some tech. Like, you really need to have be able to jack into the matrix. And there's a couple of other techs that are just insanely useful, but you really have to consider what you put on yourself because it will lose your magic. I actually think it would be interesting if you take something like that and it makes magic less useful on you because, if you cast a heal spell on somebody who's 80% robot, your heal spell will heal the fleshy part, but not the tech part. You just say that tech and magic are not compatible, which absolutely is fine, and it would create an actual detriment for that super tech. Um, Another option is to give everybody this magic. Once again, Supers games do this very well because you've got a Wanda Maximoff, this Scarlet Witch with this incredible chaos magic, and a Tony Stark with his insanely powerful, tech machinery, and effectively the two are on par, even though one uses super science, one uses magic, and then you can even take a character like a Captain America, who just is physically so powerful and technically so skilled that he can still stand kind of on his own against those two. He's fast enough to be able to do things like catch Wanda off guard and knows enough to create tactics. And even in a team setting, he is, as a soldier, tactically very smart. He is able to kind of play the role of leader and coordinate these groups of people. Um, so tech and science and physicality all stand on their own feet because they all can effectively accomplish the same thing. You can take things like mutants from the X-Men universe and say if that's a genetic, a physicality power, and take a character like Storm who can manipulate weather versus a character like Thor whose magic, MCU aside, he is a magical character who can create storms and lightning. And I'm DC has Weather Wizard. I'm sure there has to be some kind of weather manipulate tech character in Marvel that I'm blanking on. But do you see what I'm saying? Like, different power sets don't really hinder what a character can and can't do. Um, So like I said, there are couples. I don't have necessarily a perfect solution, but you know, limiting meta normal powers and allowing characters with normal powers a boost. Like I said, give fighters a taunt that draws aggro, and you could even give them some strength in the pillar of roleplay by making it like your fighter character is kind of a knight. Fighter characters earn respect and followers more than a spellcaster character would. I mean, obviously, that's something that would be hard to enforce mechanically, but I think it could be done. Fighters absolutely could gain benefit from exploration by giving them a number of powers, trap senses, and heavy resistance to things like poison and environmental effects, much kind of like a ranger would. They need to write how fix rangers. Or, like I said, you could have a character who is, because I would call being a mech pilot in Mech Warrior the combat or the physical, the martial character. He is extremely adept in combat, where a technical character would be very adept in more exploration. And then you could have social characters, because there aren't really classes. But it's almost impossible to be an amazing mech pilot and an assault mech who is also charming and witty and, a fast talker, and is also very technically adept, very skilled at things like survivalism and machine repair. And that brings me to the point about why balance is so important. Um, Obviously, in a competitive game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or like Monopoly, game balance is far more important than in a cooperative game. Because if you create an element, like let's say hypothetically obvious example, Monopoly, if you got the car, you got the ability to add one dice roll to your movement. Or maybe the top hat could earn $30 when they pass go, or was it 200? They got to earn like $250 when they pass go. You create this situation where there will be, I don't play enough Monopoly to tell you which would be better, but one would actively be better than the other, because you would have these incomparables, and people would figure out, well, if I get the car, I will win 15-20% more often. Card games are always struggling with this, releasing a card, an archetype, or a game element that shifts the way the dynamic plays. It's not as important in a cooperative game, because my tech character may not be as useful in a fight, and maybe he's not as useful as often as the assault pilot, but there comes times where my character is indispensable. So even though maybe my character's balanced a little lower than the assault pilot's, he's still useful because of how his role works. You still have to be careful, because if that balance becomes too disparaging, if he's useful 80% of the time and I'm useful 5% of the time, I no longer feel like a party member. I feel like a sidekick. I feel like a goon. I feel like somebody who might as well just be an NPC. And that's really the problem with wizards in Dungeons and Dragons, is wizards are so powerful that other characters, like druids and clerics, are on this level too. Druids kind of on their own are powerful, but like as a wizard, other characters are not there to do what they do. They are there to hold the spells I'm casting that allow them. The wizard is there to hold invisibility so he can sneak in. But the crux of what's happening is my invisibility spell. The fighter is there to store the haste spell so that he can become through my wizard. And even then, like, that's not even the most powerful thing a wizard can do in combat. So very much other characters start to feel like secondary characters. Let's look at the ranger and the barbarian. And rangers are just weaker than barbarians. And as such, as a barbarian attempts to... So I have to check... Oh, shit. I have to check the time. Sorry, I had to check the time real quick. Barbarians fight in a much more effective way than a ranger does. Now, what this means is that these two characters who are standing in this pillar of combat are not balanced against each other. If both characters need healing, that ranger is going to be always going to be second, unless something is stopping the healer from reaching the barbarian. Because that ranger heals the cleric heals the ranger, that fight will go on another 8 turns, which means that 8 more turns for bad things to happen, versus the barbarian, who is so much more powerful, might get that done in 5. That's 3 less turns for bad things to happen, not only to the barbarian, not only to the ranger, to the cleric, to the wizard, to the rogue, to the warlock. So you will always be second place to that other character, to that barbarian, to that fighter, to that paladin who is just better than you. Um, it also can lead to these elements of feeling left out. Once again, I'll bring up the locked door and the knock. I'm playing a rogue. I'm gonna check the door for traps. I'm gonna lock it. So now this is my time. This is what I do as the rogue. The wizard just goes, "Don't worry about it." Knock. Door opens. Even if there's a trap, we all stand far enough back. It's got a range of like 500 feet. We all just stand on the other side of the room. Even if there is a spear trap or a poison gas trap, it goes off. No problem. I, as the rogue, have been completely supplanted by this other character. I am no longer a useful member of the party. I now have to sit down and watch someone else do what my character is meant to do. If I want to play kind of this charming, fast-talking rogue, and a psychic character just can use mind control, I have just lost my identity because everything I can do, this preternatural character can simply do better. If my character's kind of a detective-y, problem solver, hyper intelligent character, but another character can just use magic to see the future, see the past, psychometry to see what happened, then my character is just now supplanted by this wizardy character. And that's not fun. These are, and one of the things to remember is these are games. They are supposed to be fun for everyone at the table, every player, including the DM. But if somebody can just take my character, and hypothetically, these classes are balanced against each other. Hypothetically, a level 5 fighter and a level 5 wizard should be, and a level 5 rogue should be, maybe not perfectly, but within reason, balanced against each other. So if I'm playing my rogue and everything my rogue is supposed to do is being supplanted by a different character, I'm not having fun because I am no longer engaging with the game. I think in a lot of ways you'll see this, and when people are like becoming bored with the game, they're on their phones, they're off in the corner chatting with their friend about, the whatever latest video games. I think a lot of it does come from this, where as a character, I have stopped feeling like there's any agency. Now there's storytelling agency the GM can do. He can take my rogue and give them, using part of their history, their backstory, give them a storyline. Murder, I have a murdered father, and, I'm trying to infiltrate the Thieves Guild to find out who is called for his assassination. So I've got the storyline that's mine, but if that wizard can then just use Speak with Dead to talk to my father's corpse, if that wizard can just use a divination spell to solve the problem, even though the story's mine, it's even worse now because my story has been hijacked by this far superior character. If there is a moment where a character has been betrayed, if my character is just like, "Don't worry, I found out who did it," it can feel bad because this mystery, this story, has been now pulled away from you and solved by someone else. And it's something you actually do see very often in people mention in writing, where a character's arc is being solved by a different character. Now, obviously there is places you want to go as a group table. If my mech pilot has been betrayed by his, family over something. Obviously, I want my friends to help me solve this problem. Let the hacker get a lead for us to start with, to then go let the face talk to somebody, which leads into a fight where the brawler has to, and let everybody play their part. But I also want it to be my story. If a character can just solve without, and people are going to tell me this is a DM problem, but it is very much also a power problem. Once again, oftentimes casters have so many tools in their toolkit. It's like, oh, let's go investigate. Don't worry, give me a day. I'll reset my magic and I'll have it solved. And it feels bad. So that's why balance is important, because if these characters aren't, I said, they don't have to be perfectly evenly balanced. They don't have to be 1-to-1 against each other. But if you want even a little bit of disparity is wanted, because it allows characters to feel different. I think Magic the Gathering calls it the Jedi curve. But if that gap is too big, if that gap is, that gap is too big, the character who's at the bottom has now just, he doesn't have a place, he doesn't have a role, he doesn't have a slot in this story. And that's why balancing is important in tabletop gaming. I've seen, and that Big Eye Small Mouth has the thing about balance and metagaming and power gaming being a player problem. But it's not, because as a designer, your part of your job is to make sure that every game piece, every element has a place. That's obviously, so you could even be like, hey guys, this campaign is going to be about exploring a wild wasteland with lots of runes to go into and fight monsters. You probably don't want to play characters that are super social. And if I choose to play a character that's super social, that was on me for the DM, and maybe I'll do that when I do common, because I want to do a thing where it's just short answers to common questions. But if the DM warns me, hey, this is going to be a 90% combat campaign, and I build a character that's not a combat character, it's really on me if I'm bored. But at its baseline, these games are kind of meant, if you give me a wizard, a fighter, and a rogue, and you say, hey, you have these options to play, Blue Rose has adept, expert, and warrior. I'm kind of expecting baseline all three to be good options, useful options. But that is so often not the case, that there are just options that are right. It's worse in Dungeons and Dragons than it is in a lot of other games. Like I said, in Mech Warrior, in BattleTech, the way that powers are elements are distributed, unless you take advantages as your main tier, because advantages kind of suck in that game. I might have to do a review of that with Josh one of these days. They're his books. He's got them at his house. I'd have to do it at his house with him. But the advantages just kind of suck. But, if you want to be a pilot or a skill monkey or something of that nature, it's hard to be heavily skilled and also an amazing mech pilot. You kind of have to pick what role you want to take. But that often, because people want magic to be cool and flashy and fun, which it should be, they often forget that characters who want to play tough guy, physical, awesome, characters. Yeah, you can really see my muscles through my coat and my flannel shirt, right? There ain't nothing to see there anyway, so don't worry about it. But if you want to play like this badass fighter, you should still be as useful, comparatively as useful as the wizard. And that's just a very important thing to kind of consider. But anyway, I think that's all I need to really talk about today. It's been 40 minutes and the cats have got absolute crazy zoomies. So I'll see you guys next time. Keep playing, and as always, just, if you have anything you want to comment on, anything you want me to talk about, or even any kind of polite, respectful disagreements you want to make with me, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Like the video if you like it. Share it if you know anybody who would like this kind of content. I don't know, it's that YouTube shit. But anyway, I will see you guys later.